Welcome to Wall Street versus Main Street, a different take on the investment show with our host, Dax White. Dax White is the managing partner of the White Law Group, a national securities fraud, securities arbitration, and investor protection law firm with offices in Chicago, Illinois, and Vero Beach, Florida. The White Law Group has represented hundreds of investors in FINRA arbitration claims against their brokerage firms, and throughout this show, Mr. White will shine a light on some of the tricks of the brokerage industry, while also providing valuable information for investors on how to successfully navigate the investor-financial advisor relationship.
Welcome, everyone. You're listening to Wall Street versus Main Street. I'm your host, Dax White. As the lead-in indicated, this is a different take on the investment show. We're not here to give investment advice. I'm not licensed to do so. Instead, I am a securities attorney. I represent investors in claims against brokerage firms. We do that throughout the country. And the objective of the show is to sort of pass along the information that we've gleaned from that practice that we wish investors generally knew so that they could avoid being victims of investment fraud and hopefully avoid having to use our services. So that's the objective. It's each week is we'll talk about things that are on point with what we do and pass along some of that information with the hopes of better educating the public. Last week, we talked about a movie that's out in theaters right now called The Big Short. And we talked about sort of the problems of the banking industry in 2008 and what led to the collapse and the Great Recession. This week, even though we're not turning into a movie show, I promise, but because we talked about The Big Short and because I just recently saw it with my wife, it made me think of a movie that came out recently that's even more on point with what we do. The Big Short has sort of parallel things that are certainly interesting, and you can draw references to the high fees and that we see in our practice. But the movie that came out recently that's directly on point is The Wolf of Wall Street. And if you didn't see it, that's the one with Leonardo DiCaprio where he plays the owner of a brokerage firm who rips off hundreds of people, makes tons of money, and most of the movie actually deals with his antics and sort of the craziness that was going on in his life during that time. But at its heart, what that movie really was about is classic boiler room tactics. In a boiler room, as often portrayed in the movie, is basically a brokerage firm set up where they've just got a huge bank of phones, and they pay guys who just graduated from college to just cold call hundreds and hundreds of people. Like, who knows where they get their investor lists, but they're basically on the phone cold calling you, trying to sell you securities, and they're using scare tactics. They're using enormous promises. You're going to make a ton of money. They're using, you got to do this now. It's going to be too late. All the sort of classic scenarios to try to get you to invest with them. And that is at the heart of how, the guy from Wolf of Wall Street was making his money, is he owned one of those. Again, the movie's about his life and it's about, again, sort of the excesses of his life as they were making a ton of money ripping people off. But at the heart, what it is basically, talking about boiler room, brokerage firms. And what's really interesting is I actually know lawyers who were hoping for that movie to do well because they represented people who had been defrauded by that guy who still hasn't paid them. And they thought if the movie did really well, maybe he'd have some money to pay our clients. So, that happened 20-something years ago, but you want to talk about direct parallels and real life applications. Again, there are still clients that got screwed by that guy and still lawyers that represented people who are still waiting to get paid. And so, that's directly on point. Boiler room tactics in general, we actually don't see a lot of anymore. That used to be far more common during the time period that movie takes place. Late 80s, early 90s, you saw it a lot more then. The industry has actually done a pretty good job of cleaning that up. And if you ever do get a cold call from a financial advisor who's trying to pressure you, get their information and report them to FINRA, because FINRA will investigate them and they will sanction them for those practices. It's basically, not unlike lawyers who don't always have the best reputation, and it's like the worst of the worst who gives us a reputation. This is the scourge of the brokerage industry, and 99.9% of financial advisors don't do this, and they hate that reputation that's created by that 0.1% that do. So this is one of those areas where they actually do a really good job of regulating the firms that do this kind of stuff. And they do step in, sanction them, and try to put them out of business if they really are that classic firm that doesn't do anything but just rip people off, selling them garbage, trying to make commissions. So, that's the good news is that those kinds of activities aren't as common, but it does sort of highlight one of the problems that we do see in our practice, which is, what these boiler rooms would do is they'd get their lists. They'd have, again, this huge bank of. There actually is a great movie that's older called Boiler Room that is excellent and talks a lot about this as well. But you hire these kids straight out of school, and you just get them to cold call people. You give them a script, you tell them what to say, and these are things that you wouldn't expect to exist in an industry that relies on investment advice and fiduciary duty and all these things where we're supposed to be able to rely on these people to take care of us and make sure that they're making good investment recommendations, but there are companies out there where they'll do this, and if they get sued, they just shut it down, close, open up across the street with a new name, and start it up again. And again, while the industry is good about stepping in, it's hard to make sure that they don't come back, because usually they'll come back as some sort of shell corporation where the actual guy who runs the scam doesn't put his name on it. He'll buy it through some holding company, and he'll make, one of his buddies the CEO. And it's hard for the regulator to figure out, oh, wait, it's the same guy. He's just doing it under a new name, and they'll come in and shut him down again. And this just continues to happen. And the problem, and the reason that does continue to happen, and we see this in our cases all the time. The problem is that it's just too darn easy to open a brokerage firm. The bar is incredibly low to open a brokerage firm. A lot of firms are undercapitalized. It takes maybe $10,000 in net capital to own and operate a brokerage firm, depending on the type of business that it's trying to do. And there are different hoops, but none of the hoops are high. It doesn't cost a lot of money to start a brokerage firm. Brokerage firms are not required to carry insurance. So if they're doing bad acts and you sue them, they won't necessarily have the money to pay. And again, that's why I say we see this all the time in our practices, because oftentimes the cases that we're dealing with, which are generally the worst of the brokerage industry, the harder part for me is not evaluating the liability. Am I going to win? If I go try this case, am I going to win? That part's usually pretty self-evident. The hard part is the collectability. Never heard of this firm. I can do some research. They are required to update their financials on an annual basis, but you can make your financials look however you want. You can just be sucking the money out of the firm and make it look like you're not really doing well, and they do that. And again, there's no requirement they have insurance. And so when you're evaluating claims, the hardest part is figuring out, do I think that if we win, or when we win, because the facts are that good, when we win, are they going to pay? And that's still out there. The boiler room tactics they're better at, but they haven't raised the bar. It's still incredibly easy to own and operate a brokerage firm, which, if the advice takeaway from today is, if there's any advice takeaway from today, it's make sure you're doing business with a large reputable company, because at least then, I will say this, big brokerage firms, your Morgan Stanleys, your Merrill Lynch's, your Wells Fargo's, these types of firms, they generally do a better job of compliance and making sure that their financial advisors, follow FINRA rules and SEC rules, et cetera. But they're not perfect. They're just like any large corporation. If you hire somebody who's a bad guy and he wants to abuse the system, he'll figure out how to abuse the system and where the chinks in the armor are, and he'll do so. But the good news is, at least, if that occurs and you sue Morgan Stanley and you win, you're going to get paid. They're a huge company. They're not going anywhere. No matter how much money you lost, I promise you Morgan Stanley can pay it. But so, the advice takeaway would be work with a company where, worst case scenario, if I have to sue them, are they going to be able to pay me? And if you're with a small company, ask them, do you have insurance? It's not required, but a lot of them do. And they're usually the good ones, because they're looking at it from a smart business practice where they're saying, okay, if I'm going to be doing this for a career and I'm going to have 50, 60, 100 clients, what are the chances one of them might be mad at me at some point and sue me? Chances are pretty good. I'm going to carry some, so I don't have to worry about it. So ask them if they're a smaller firm, you've never heard of their company before, ask them if they have insurance. And if they say no, that's a red flag. But certainly, we see that. And again, parallel back to Wolf of Wall Street, again, I still have lawyer friends who are trying to collect from the guy 20 something years later. So, you'd much rather be in a situation. FINRA does have rules that say that if you win or if you settle, but they don't pay within 30 days, either from an award or from a settlement. If they don't pay within 30 days, FINRA takes their license away. So if it's a big reputable company, that's all the hammer you need. Morgan Stanley does not want to stop operations for even a minute because of your case. They make far too much money doing what they do. And so within 30 days of an award being issued or 30 days of a settlement, they pay. But the problem comes in where the company is so small that one case puts them under, or the guy's a bad guy and he knows, I'm just going to shut it down. I'm going to make my buddy the CEO. I'm going to open up another one and I'm never going to pay that claim. FINRA makes it too easy for that. And so that's sort of my takeaway from the Wolf of Wall Street, other than it's just fun to watch the guy sort of go down a spiral of drug excess and money and greed and all that stuff. And certainly the girl from it's beautiful, but the larger implication is sort of what we see and the problem with the industry in terms of, again, they've cleaned up the boiler room, but just make sure you're with a large company. In terms of that boiler room tactic, unfortunately, again, we don't see in our practice because we sue brokerage firms, but those tactics are still out there. And so I want to pass on some tips on how to avoid being a victim of such tactics, because we do hear about it and we do see it in contexts that don't involve brokerage firms. Usually the context we see it in would be somebody who's trying to sell you either commodities or Forex trading, which is, currency trades, or maybe some options tradings. But it has the same basic application. They cold called you. You have no idea how they got your information. That's your first question. How'd you find me? And they've got the script. They immediately run into, oh, don't worry about that. Let me tell you about this great opportunity I have and all this money we're going to be able to make. And you got to do it right away. And you got to wire me the money. Those kinds of tactics are still out there. And again, it's not generally FINRA firms, because brokerage firms, FINRA does a decent job regulating, and they'll come in and shut those firms down quickly. And it's not I don't think they make a lot of money, so they stop doing it because FINRA gets to them before they can make a ton of money. But you do see it, or you do hear about it in the context of firms that are regulated by different agencies. The Forex firms, they've got their own, arbitration provisions. Commodities, those are usually national futures cases, NFA. They're based in Chicago. I've worked on those. I generally don't because of that collectability problem. And at the end of the day, we're a contingency fee law firm. So if we can't get the client money, we don't get paid. And it's like the Wild West with those companies. So if you're getting cold called by them with those kind of pressure tactics, hang up. Those firms are bad news. And they are out there. They still do exist. And it's, if you've seen the Wolf of Wall Street, it's the same pitch. It's the same thing, but it's just not brokerage usually. It's something else. But I think the last case that we had was a dentist who lost like $500,000 quickly. And that's the other thing with these things is, you send them $500,000 and you're getting your statements and your investment didn't go down, but where'd the money go? And it's all been sort of very quickly bled through commissions and margin interest and this fee and that fee. Boom, it's gone. I think with this guy, it was within 6 months. We brought suit, and by the time we had brought suit, the FBI had already stepped in. The guy was under house arrest. The company that he operated under was just him. They had frozen his bank accounts, but there was very little left. And long story short, there wasn't much we could do for that guy because, he wasn't dealing with a huge company. The guy didn't have insurance. The guy didn't have any money. He basically just bled him, and I'm sure he spent it or absconded with it in some way. And we see that too often in those boiler room tactics. That's basically the objective, is to just extricate you from your money. I don't know what the percentages of likelihood that you would actually make any money dealing with one of these guys. I would suspect that it's incredibly low. So if you're getting those calls, please, avoid them. In terms of other applications, I I would say, again, commodities, options, Forex, it's all high-risk stuff. And usually they're also suggesting you do it on margin, which margin is probably a whole nother episode, but margin is basically borrowing against your own security so that you can buy more. That increases your risk. In theory, it increases your upside, but there's fees associated with it. And usually when they're talking about these boiler room tactics, the objective is to bleed you from commissions and fees as quickly as possible. Again, the dentist example is the perfect one, but we have seen that a number of times where, the client's saying, okay, well, I bought, the live cattle options, and the price of live cattle didn't change in the 6 months that I invested with this guy, but my money's gone. Where did it go? And you sort of run through the statements and you try to figure it out, and it's all commissions, fees. Again, their job is to try to extricate you from your money as quickly as possible. So in terms of just the overview, boiler room tactics, if you get a call from somebody who's trying to sell you an investment and you don't know who they are, that should be all you really need to know. The financial advice industry, just like any industry, has good apples and bad apples, but there are plenty of good ones. I work with a lot of financial advisors who are fantastic, and that's not how they get their clients. They're not on the phone cold calling people saying, here's this great investment, I can make you 50% today. They don't do that. Their job is long-term. The good financial advisors, usually they want to be on the same side as you. They're usually taking a small 1% typically of the assets that they're managing for you. And they want to grow it just as you want to grow it, because that means they make more money. And they're looking at a long-term view. If you're my client for 20 years, and I make 1% every year for 20 years and I do my job, I'm going to make far more money off of you than if I just sell you some garbage right now and make a quick buck. So, that's generally the model of the good financial advisors. That's the one you should be looking for. But if you're getting a cold call from somebody, get their information and report them to a regulator. If it's an options case or a commodities case, that regulator, again, is the NFA. If they are a brokerage firm, and again, I don't see it as much, but it does exist. If it's a brokerage firm, report them to FINRA. We're going to take a break. When we come back, I'll put a bow on this discussion. Thanks.
DuBose & Sons Jewelers. Inside, you'll find Mike DuBose sitting in the back, head down, wearing that weird little visor. You know the one. It has a magnifying glass on it. You see, Mike is a real jeweler, a master jeweler. Mike DuBose and his sons are experts, but they're also your neighbor. They'll treat you like family. Citizen watches, diamonds, necklaces, anklets, rings, special orders, and of course, custom pieces by master jewelers. DuBose & Sons Jewelers in the Colonial Plaza, Old Dixie, Vero Beach, between 8th and 12th Street.
It's time to call Easy Brew Coffee and Bottled Water Service and learn just how much you can save and how convenient it is to have your coffee and bottled water delivered right to your home or office. In addition to water coolers, Easy Brew offers individual bottles of water in 8 or 16-ounce bottles. No more lugging it home or dragging it into the office. Serving the Treasure Coast for over 2 decades, 2 letters, 1 simple name. EZ for Easy Brew. Visit e-zbrew.com or call 800-792-3285. Easy Brew.
ITEX, or International Trade Exchange, is the largest barter company in the world, with over 25,000 members offering goods and services. We're a marketing company that brings you new business in the way of trade, with over 200 local members enjoying the benefits of ITEX, like lawyers, doctors, plumbers, media, printing, and more.
Hi, this is Liz Bowler. Contact me and find out why barter through ITEX has been smarter for over 30 years. 772-532-1881. Visit itex.com.
Blue Dolphin Pools strives to provide quality service with a well-trained staff in the field and in the office. They want you to know that your pool or spa investment means much more to them than just another account. They believe you have entrusted them with your investment, and they'll do their best to see that it stays in top condition. Blue Dolphin Pool has been in business over 35 years, setting them apart from the competition. Residential or commercial, Blue Dolphin will keep you in the swim. 567-5853.
Welcome back, everyone. You're listening to Wall Street versus Main Street. I'm your host, Dax White. Before the break, we talked about the movie The Wolf of Wall Street. And I talked about some of the parallels to things that we see in our practice. And hopefully the big takeaway there was that you should be working with large companies because FINRA does make it too easy for small brokerage firms to exist, and not all of them are very good. And if they get sued, they just shut it down, and you're left holding the bag. And so, the obvious benefit then of dealing with a larger company was just the collectability problem. Worst case scenario, I'm stuck in a situation where I have to sue my brokerage firm. If I win, are they going to be around to pay? And so that would be the main benefit of dealing with a large company. But one other thing that I wanted to dive into, we've got a couple more minutes here, was a secondary benefit of the larger company versus those smaller, what I would call independent brokerage firms. And there's thousands of independent brokerage firms out there. And the other collateral benefit to dealing with larger companies has to do with how they generally supervise their financial advisors. And there's two basic models, and it's sort of big company versus little company, but generally the way they're described is the independent model versus the wirehouse model. And the wirehouses, the best examples of those would be your Morgan Stanleys, your Goldman Sachs, your Merrill Lynch, your Wells Fargo, those types of companies. They generally have, the way they're set up is, they'll have an office in Miami, and they'll have 20 financial advisors in that office. And also on that same floor is going to be, a head of operations, a head of compliance, a head of supervision, a branch manager, all the people who are involved in making sure that the business is operating correctly and complying with the rules. And they usually will also have very sophisticated triggers set up where the branch manager gets an alert if something potentially untoward is happening. An example would be a high turnover ratio in an account, which would be indicative of potentially maybe our financial advisors is churning this account. The branch manager will get a trigger that says, okay, the turnover ratio in this account is now X, and then he will follow with the financial advisor to make sure they can explain it away, and that's actually what the client wants, and if necessary, they'll actually call you. And that's the kind of supervision that you're generally going to see at the larger wirehouse, where everybody's on the ground working together in collaboration, and it's much easier, I would suggest, for them to supervise in that context. And again, it's not perfect. We definitely still have cases against those firms, but we've got fewer cases, and oftentimes they're less egregious because I do think those firms do a better job of compliance, even better than they did maybe 10, 15 years ago. And I think that's probably has a lot to do with technology as opposed to the model. I just think that they're able to pick up on some of these things quicker. Again, turnover ratio, that might have slipped a radar year, 2 years, you don't even realize. But now they've got automatic triggers that I think is more computerized. But generally speaking, I think the compliance of these larger wirehouse firms is better. The independent model, part of the reason that you've got more compliance issues is generally the way they operate is they've got home office in Kansas City or St. Louis or Minneapolis. And I'm not picking those three cities out of random. Those, for whatever reason, have lots of brokerage firms. I'm sure there's a tax benefit to it, but those three cities have a ton of brokerage firms. But let's say they've got, main office there, and then they've got 300 financial advisors who are sort of operating independently with their own, DBA, doing business as, but they clear their transactions through the parent corporation. And that parent corporation will send somebody to that financial advisor's, office in a strip mall someplace in, Dallas, Texas or whatever. And they'll go there about once a year and they'll look through the files and they'll call it an audit. And they'll basically say, okay, you're doing great. And then that's it. And so obviously from a supervisory standpoint, you're seeing a lot less involvement and a lot less oversight. And so, yeah, that's where we see the majority of our problems is because you've got lone wolf out on his own, but you've got a brokerage firm whose job is to supervise them. So we go after the brokerage firm for their failure to do it. But again, you're going to see a lot more of those problems in the independent model. So that's reason too, maybe, if there's a takeaway from the show, focus on, larger companies because it's not just the collectability of them, but they do generally do a bit better job of compliance. So thanks for listening in. If you want more information on the show or just, how to avoid becoming a victim of securities fraud, check us out at wallstreetvmainstreet.com. Thanks.
You've been listening to Wall Street versus Main Street. The views expressed by the participants of the program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by, the White Law Group, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, nor any of its subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer.